Hey guys, this is Sam. I'll go ahead and start since I believe my piece is up first. So we're Team Variation. We're Dave, Ron, myself, Sam, and Danielle. And this is our Almar Paint Company case study, part 2. Next slide. Okay, so the outcomes and goals for our benchmarking project. So the primary goal is gap analysis of the sister plant to determine cause of performance and efficiency differences between the East and West Coast plants, and to make recommendations to senior management of how to close the identified gaps at the West Coast plant through adoption of verified best practices. The key areas that we're focusing on include staff productivity, which is looking at the output of each full-time employee. And the key performance indicators for full-time employees are going to be proficiency and workload. Proficiency is going to be measured by the number of operator stations that each employee is qualified at. And then the workload is going to be measured through overtime and the number of production runs each employee participates in per month. The process efficiency is going to provide details on whether procedures and systems are supporting the operations, and the KPIs for that are error rate and forecast accuracy. Cycle time is measuring how long the task is going to take to complete, and it includes processing time and time to resolve customer inquiry. And then employee satisfaction measures the overall operational health and is derived from the survey questions. Next slide. The methodology used, we did the operational internal primary benchmark. We did interview questions, which targeted the production line managers and the QA supervisor for their perspectives, and then conducted pre and post survey interviews with the managers at the East Coast plant. The questionnaire focused on process variations and line employee experiences, which yielded 60 pages of notes. And then the surveys were given to all production line employees at both locations to determine that job satisfaction. And then we received back 40 total surveys, 20 from each plant. Next slide.
So this is the first slide, basically diving into the raw data that we obtained, firstly with the human resources, and then we're going to continue on with other pieces of data that we're going to display and kind of show it how it all pieces together towards the end. This first slide is, at first, it's just the human resource comparison of your production line workers and how do they relate to each other. The east side is in blue, west side is in green. This data on its own seems like they're pretty close to each other and kind of like normal. We're going to relate this data later on to other data and kind of see how it all pieces together. But as far as pointing out anything on this, everything seems kind of normal. East Coast has slightly higher average age than the West, but right now the data is kind of typically normal. Next slide. This is just another, the same kind of like information that we got from human resources, specifically focusing in on the managers. And again, not too much difference if you look at kind of, you know, positions qualified and all that. There's a little bit of a wider age gap, but, you know, that's not too far off. And there's nothing more that I can really say right now with our related data. We'll talk about this slide when we go forward. Next slide, please. So this is a comparison, again, HR data, kind of where each individual site is getting their workforce from. There is a big gap that you can see where the West Coast is hiring primarily from Craigslist, where there's more of a diversity in the East Coast. This could indicate something, that maybe that there should be a more diverse, you know, hiring pool that could be done in the West Coast, but for right now, it's a gap that could be investigated further. Next slide. And then we broke the information down into education. Once again, it's a little bit more diverse in the East. They have more college, community college, not as much high school, where the West is primarily 95% they're full of high school students with some community college, and that could possibly be an indication that could be looked into further to see if that could be more diverse, or look into the hiring pool of the individuals at each site. Next slide. Okay, so this is a sample of the survey that we sent out. This is basically to yield qualitative data from production line employees regarding basically their job satisfaction. How do they feel working? This employee satisfaction information provides organizations with subjective evaluation and perceptions of how basically their employees are feeling, kind of get a gauge of what they like. As you can see, it's a Likert scale with factors from 1 through 5, with 1 strongly disagree, 5 strongly agree, with 3 typically being kind of neutral or no opinion. This survey, as was said before, was given to all production line employees from both plants. There was a total of 40 surveys with 20 surveys for each site. Next slide. So here's where we get the feedback from those surveys. The East Coast is represented in blue again, West Coast represented in green. You can kind of see there. I threw in this kind of like red dotted line. I call it an agreement line, and if you will, basically, if you remember the Likert scale, anything, well, 3 being neutral, but anything above a 3 average would be an agreement, and to some degree, with 5 being most agreeable, and anything below this line would essentially be a disagreement. As you can see, most of the things were in the agreement zone. The only thing that's below the agreement zone is the job hunting, whereas there's a disagreement in job hunting, more of a disagreement on the East Coast. So that tends to say that the people in the East Coast might want to stay there, where the West Coast, you know, is looking out there more than their East Coast counterparts. If you remember, I don't know if you were looking at the Likert scale, but just to go over like each individual subject, feedback is basically how can I improve myself? Are they getting feedback from their bosses? Opportunity is there a lot of chance to move up or get promoted in the company? Training, the question was asked, am I sufficiently being taught how to do my job? You know, these are questions being asked. Encourage is basically when I make a mistake, am I encouraged to learn from it? Challenged is the job that I'm doing rewarding or engaging, kind of gauging how they're feeling on that. Accountable, are the people accountable for their work? So I'm assuming it's their colleagues or whatever. Is the work remediated and good work praised, or it doesn't matter? So if anything goes wrong, is it being fixed? When something goes right, do they get, you know, good feedback? Respect is basically how comfortable they are and with their manager, and if they admire their leader as a professional and as a leader himself. Leadership, they're looking into how they feel about the executives, the senior leadership of the site. Satisfaction is the overall contentment of the job. How satisfied are they with the job? And again, we go back to 10, job hunting. So let's take a closer look at the next slide, please. I kind of made a better visual. So as we said before, the agreement line, everything below the agreement line, everything was above the agreement line, and the only thing that was taken out is the job hunting. Taking all that, you know, out of it, and being that 3 is neutral, we took an average of all the feedback that we got from the site, and you can kind of see this slide shows you where the gaps lie. We can start going around again the feedback. We have a moderate agreement from the East site. where they feel they are getting feedback. If you look at the west side, however, the data shows a more neutral feeling, maybe an indication that they're not getting the feedback, or the feedback that is being given to them is not as constructive. So that could be an indication there, something to look into. Opportunity, there's a slight gap between the East and the West, but in perspective, both companies feel that the opportunities are there for them to move up in the company. So the gap is very small there. As for training, data shows a significant gap between the East and the West. East feels that training is appropriate, where the East Coast employees may want to see more of a guidance and more instruction. Possibly further comparison between both training programs at each site should be looked into, and possibly look for improvement. Encouragement, when they make a mistake, do they feel encouraged to learn from the mistakes? Again, the gap is small, and they actually gave a good high reading. So that, and also challenge, is the job that they're doing rewarding. Both sides kind of gave big, strong agreements to those numbers, so there's not really too much of a gap there. The accountable, I'm sorry, are people held accountable for the work? Is, you know, bad work remediated, good work praised, or does it matter? The East side data shows they have a strong agreement from the folks that there is accountability, where the West Coast feels slightly less about accountability. So there may be something there to look into, how it's kind of shows maybe like an indication of the management style, which kind of shows more in the next couple, which is the respect and leadership. Remember, these were the two that were honing in on the leadership and the senior management in the company. For managers and seniors leaderships in the East, the East side employees have more respect and admire the direction that the company is being led into. You can see, you know, they almost have like the highest marks out of the whole radar chart. The West, however, has less a feeling of agreement and confidence in their management. So that is, you know, tell that something needs to be looked at there. There's got to be some kind of comparison between management styles, or maybe the programs that they're running, that could possibly be something to look at. And last but not least, satisfaction. How overall content are they in their job? This suggests there's, you know, there's a huge gap between both sides. There's a major gap between East and West side. East side, they feel overall satisfied, where the West Coast not so much. So from this data, I'm kind of compelled to say that the West feels that the job itself is under control, but they're seeking more improvement on the direction and execution of the product lines itself, and kind of probably looking more to the leadership to guide them on the West. Next slide, please. So the data we just saw resonated with what we saw in the HR data. So I'm going to try to relate it here a little bit. As we saw, the West Coast employees had less experience at the site and on the production line. This could be related to the desire for more direction and more training from the West, I mean. And also, it stands to reason that the dissatisfaction and the frustration from the West side could lead to an increase of people calling out and being late for work. So you can see, you know, there's more sick days, you know, on the side of the West, and more lates for work, whereas not so much for the vacation side. So you can kind of see there could be a morale element to the workforce that should be looked into further, kind of like picking up the morale, and maybe people want to go to work and maybe try harder. It could be an indication that we see from this data. Next slide, please. And we could also take the analysis further, and we can clearly see, this is going back to the managers, human resources. We can clearly see that the managers in the East are far more experienced. They had more years on the site. They have more years on the production line itself. Even though that they both have the maximum amount of knowledge, meaning the 9 different positions that they qualified for are pretty much the same, you could definitely see that there's a gap in experience level. and there may be an opportunity to get a best practices alignment between these managers of these sites, and maybe if they're willing, maybe do a swap, maybe try some East Coast managers on the east side to go to the west and see how that makes a difference. I think that's all I have for you right now. Yeah, can you go to the next slide? Introduce Danielle if she's still on.
Yeah, I'm here. I had to call in.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am, you're good.
All right, thanks. So we're looking at the recommendations to close the gap. So these are some of the things that we've already been talking about. So closing the gap, one of the things we're looking at was, of course, the hiring sources was a large factor. You can see the big differences between East Side does not hire from Craigslist like the West Side does. So maybe using more reputable hiring sources will bring employees with more skills, experience, abilities, and improve productivity. Additionally, we can also see the big gap between the education levels between plants is also a major factor, with most of the majority of the West Side having high school experience versus some kind of college education. So we should be looking for quality personnel, maybe instead of looking for a quantity of individuals. We might want to look at some kind of college education as to then within the hiring process. Management practices, training, one of the questions that they were asked is, am I sufficiently taught how to do my job? And there was a gap here, so the East did feel that training was appropriate, where the West Side employees may want to see some more guidance and instruction as far as training was concerned. And same kind of thing with your feedback and accountability from the East Side, where they feel that they are getting feedback. The West Side, however, data shows more of a neutral indication here, with which they may not be getting the feedback that's not being given, and it may not be constructive as to what the employees feel. Also, training, if it's appropriate, where the West Side employees want to see more guidance and instruction, the West Side does feel significantly less about accountability in comparison to the East. That brings us into production improvement. So we did notice here that the East Side does group its orders together, which did save 30 minutes of switching to container sizes and producing smaller lots first, followed by larger lots. So this seems to be working well for them. But definitely this is something to look into. Lastly, also the QA process at both plants. The study did say it takes the same amount of time. However, this process, I think, could be improved as the West Side plant does stop production for pigment testing, unlike the East Side plant. So additionally, relying on that spectrometer parameters over a visual inspection could also reduce the rejected orders that have been a continuing issue. And next slide, please.
All right, so we have implementation plan. So the first one is hiring process. So first, we're going to look at internal talent and having a ranking system internally so that we know who's promotable internally. That way we can keep talent internal, and hopefully with promoting people internally, we can have some better retention at our plant. That we need to keep the talent up, and hopefully we can, with higher retention rates, we can keep a better knowledge base on our product and how to run our business. So hopefully we can do that, and we're going to implement yearly review system using some of the criteria that here. Do the employees think and act strategically to anticipate our customer needs? Do they get results through themselves and through learning, safety, continuous improvement? Do they build organizational capability to ensure a robust pipeline of diverse talent to capitalize on opportunities? So are our employees taking advantage of training and going back to school and stuff like that? So growing the organizational capability from a training point of view, external training, college, and potentially internal training with a training system internally. And then thinks and acts strategically. to anticipate customer needs like at the beginning, but also to grow the business and make high quality decisions. So a little bit of twist on the beginning to add decision making into it, and then gets results to yourself and others. Definitely some good things to make our employees more robust as far as a pool of well thought out, well thinking, educated, trained people. So, and then we're gonna start a higher education recruiting program, taking advantage of local schools, job fairs, and job boards on campuses. Next slide. Next one's management practices. So implement a new employee training program derived from a training matrix with the requirements of each employee by job title. So each job will have the requirements for that job and a training matrix to make sure each employee in their job is actually trained properly and has the all their bases covered as far as whether they need to be trained internally or trained externally, and how many people have that training now, and where we have to go to get everybody to the point where all their jobs are covered properly. And then put in place an employee feedback system for both corrective actions due to job performance and also yearly feedback with measures on job performance. So a overall review system for ongoing feedback for how they're performing their job, and then if there are issues with how they're performing their job, a corrective action system so that people can be held accountable. And then the final is production improvement. So we're going to implement a new MRP strategy to break down orders by customer, the color of the paint, and the size of the containers that they need. And then we're going to change the organizational culture to revolve around what's best for the customer to receive their what's best for the customer and so they can receive their product the quickest way possible. So put in for capital to purchase new automated quality tools so that the plant isn't relying on human inspection. It's actually using automated color verification and stuff like that to improve the process. Next slide. And that's it. Any questions?
Very, very nice. Cohort, feedback, if you want me to slide to a particular slide, I'll roll you back.
I think it was an outstanding brief. I pretty much I really liked the slides where they were showing the graphs and how it depicts the situation. Yes, the satisfaction survey and East Coast West Coast comparison, that was on the money, and certainly gives me some food for thought. Really, I really liked the presentation. Those charts were really accurate and easy to understand, and the data was there for us to see and comprehend easily. Thank you, team.
Thanks, Judith. That was a good summary. Look, guys, I was real impressed with your presentation, the way you led into the subjects. It had a good natural flow to it, and it crescendoed right at the right spot. It was just long enough to hold everybody's attention, and your covering of the data was good. Other positive comments here is that, the other teams can't see this, but on my screen I can see your speaker's notes, and I always appreciate when master's students include their speaker's notes in their slides. It helps you to stay on focus of what you're saying and not just ramble off into some third dimension that you didn't intend to go down to. So speaker's notes keep you from going down rabbit holes. I also appreciate that you took some time and stopped and talked about the survey, because this is really what makes up your data. And we'll see this in other presentations coming up. A good use of the radar chart. And you know, there's a bit of a red herring here. And I don't know if you remember me telling you, but when we were talking about these questions, questions 9 and 10, those are dependent variables. You cannot do anything about them. You know, I'm actively looking for a job. All right, you can't do anything about it. You can't tell people not to do it. And this, I'm very satisfied with my job. You can't do anything about that either. But it's all these other things above it that you think is what's contributing to what the satisfaction is. So if I had to give this presentation, I would probably drop number 10 because it looks awkward when it gets into your presentation. Or I would have flipped it. You know, even, you know, like I say, when when you're planning for your benchmark, you only get one chance to ask the question. But you know, here's how the question's asked. I'm actively looking for a job outside this organization. And if they are scoring 5s and 4s. If they weren't, they're getting less. And the results showed that it looks like they're really not. You know, it's below what the norm was considered to be. I'm not sure that there's much of a value in this particular thing, and it's distracting to the eye. And because it's a dependent variable, I probably would have just tossed it. That said, I really like the conversation about satisfaction. Back to satisfaction. I'm very satisfied with my job. That too is a dependent variable, but it does kind of sum up all the stuff that you've been asking above them. So it feeds into your story well. Remember, you're selling this stuff and you're talking about the gap. As you come around your circle, you're pointing out the gap. Not much of a gap on opportunity, a little bit of gap on training, not much between encouragement and challenge, all right? And then you start over on this side, and that's where you spent your time. You have a 2-point gap across all this stuff, and that's where you're making your points. All right, then I particularly liked this slide. The gap is easy to see. You only dealt with stuff that was above the agreement line and help the audience just focus their attention on the areas that needed improvement. Very nice. Any other comments? All right.
I like that they mentioned the training matrix because that's one of the things that even Cameron and my job, they have mentioned a lot of pretty much also creating a deadline for when those trainings are supposed to take place, but knowing where each person is at. That definitely did it definitely throws some value on there to see who's straggling or who's actually ahead.
Well, Edgar, it just shows that they're putting it in writing too. We're going to make this. We're going to take a matrix, and this is how we're going to go forward with our training. So I agree. Nice job for team variation. And Edgar, now that you're on, it's you guys that are up next anyway. So here's your Almar Team UTC presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Cameron, loud and clear. I'm going to go on mute now. You just tell me when to advance.
Okay. So this is Team UTC, which is Edgar Martinez and myself, Cameron Helland, and this is our Almar paint case study. Next slide, please. All right, so looking at outcomes and goals for our benchmark. It was expressed by our charter, our charter focused on increasing 3 key areas, which was productivity, employee satisfaction, and searching for best practices. So looking at those 3, so increasing productivity, it's obviously closing the gap between the 2 sister plants, West Coast and East Coast. We know that the East Coast plant has produced 25% more paint and has had no defects this past year, while the West Coast plant has struggled with their production and efficiency and has also had 2 large orders that were returned this quarter due to improper pigmentation. And then also looking at employee satisfaction, it's reducing the employee turnover rate at the West Coast plant. It was expressed that the West Coast plant has a high employee turnover rate, as well as they've gone through 2 shift supervisors in the past 6 months, and half of their production line employees have turned over this past year. So that's definitely an area that needs to be addressed. And then, of course, best practices. Look to not only close the gap, but exceed the gap through continuous improvement, and trying to not only mirror the sister East Coast plant, but to look for ways or ideas to surpass them in productivity. Next slide, please.
So methodology is to plan establishing scope, collecting the data, setting the criteria for the team, to actually go out and collect the data, to analyze, validate information that was collected, really look at the actual gaps, and pretty much create visuals to make it more detailed and easier to explain. After that would be to adapt, which is to report to the champion and develop an action plan for implementation. And then finally, implementation, which is to establish and control the actual plan. Majorly, the key point is to maintain it, not to just say we're going to do this and 3 months down the road, we're back to the old habits. Next slide.
All right, so looking at the performance gaps, this is the survey data or the qualitative data. And as you can see, out of the 10 aspects of the employee survey, being feedback, opportunity, training, encourage, challenge, accountable, respect, leadership, satisfaction, and job hunting, you can see that the East Coast plant has all positive feedback in all aspects that were surveyed, except for, well, I mean, job hunting, that's like the professor said, it's something that you really can't control. And so the West Coast plant has many close responses to the East Coast plant. However, they scored negative in the aspects of respect, leadership, satisfaction, and of course, job hunting. But that's another thing that you really can't manage. So really focusing on satisfaction, leadership, and respect sounds more like a leadership issue, a supervisor issue, a managerial issue. I mean, it looks like they get plenty of opportunities like the East Coast. The training is a little less than the East Coast, but that's something that definitely can look into. But they feel just as encouraged, just as challenged, and about just as accountable as the East Coast plant. So definitely the main focus would be on respect, leadership, and satisfaction.
Another point to add to this one was that Cameron and I were discussing some of the interesting aspects of this regarding specifically to the leadership aspect. The West Coast plant, their supervisors were there pretty much for roughly about 3 years, 3 years and 2.5 years. All the other workers were either 3 years or under, so there really isn't a lot of promotion. And it led us to kind of think about the possibility of how a lot of the people, when you work together with them and no one is really moving up, it tends to become a little bit more of a negative aspect in a sense. So that's why we kind of thought that there was that loss of respect all the way going into leadership and job satisfaction. Because even the East Coast plant, their supervisors had been, I mean, they've had 10 and 11 years worth of experience in the plant, and all the operators underneath them, they range anywhere from 6 years down to within just a few months. So there's a big, that was one of the things that we were looking at in terms of the numbers and how it might actually correlate to their answers to the survey. Next slide. So this kind of goes along with the gaps themselves. This is where we can actually see a little bit more of what I was just talking about in the previous one. This is actually more for the operators. So there were some little things that we, not necessarily, well, I guess kind of a trend. So the East Coast plant did have definitely more of a positive performance pattern when speaking about years at plant, years on the line, and number of qualified positions. Even though they had more vacation use, they didn't have many late to work instances. and the pattern kind of crosses over even to the West Coast plant, although it did have more sick days used and late for work instances. And so we're looking at, does that coincide along with the years at the plant and years on the line? And I might be jumping a little bit too far ahead, but we were also discussing about how the education aspect comes into play with that, since most of the people on the West Coast plant were hired pretty much at a high school, or they have a high school education level, sorry. And they were all hired out through Craigslist. So we just thought it was an interesting thing to look at for those two instances. Next slide.
So yeah, going off of what Edgar was talking about with the education levels, comparing the East Coast and the West Coast, as you can see on the left, the East Coast, 65% of their employees have a community college level or higher education. So that's half of their hiring is coming from a community college job center, as opposed to the West Coast, where 95% of their employees have an education level of high school, and their only hiring source is Craigslist. So Edgar and I were discussing that, maybe if the West Coast focused more on looking at the community college job centers, or even say looking at a LinkedIn or a Monster or something like that, they might get a more valued employee that won't leave in 6 months like they seem to be having at the West Coast plant. Next slide. Edgar?
Sorry about that. So this is where we were looking at the performance gap, and I was talking about it a little bit after the radar chart, and how the manager's numbers kind of have an effect on the survey questions, more specifically to do with the accountability, respect, leadership, satisfaction. You have the East Coast they have not better promotion, they have more longevity in terms of their supervisors. And so when those supervisors are there, they usually tend to be more respected. They know the process, they can be counted on, and they actually are pretty good at motivating their employees and also helping them grow and moving on, furthering their career. So the two things that kind of stood out is just that both the East Coast plant managers, they have an average age of 39.5 years of education levels of GED and community college, so it is higher education. Touching back to what Cameron was saying about, although it was more for operators, sorry about that. The West Coast plant has an average of 31, so there is somewhat of a distance in between them. Although there is a high school education called community college education, we were still really delving and discussing about how not only the education but the longevity of the supervisors tends to lead to either more positive or negative operators, and how that affects the productivity of the plant. Next slide.
All right, so our recommendations to close the gap, it was expressed that the QA manager at the West Coast was a bit old school and preferred not to use the spectrometer for their examining their paint. So one thing is to look into actually using that on the production floor to eliminate defects and make a, say, efficient and better way of measuring the paint. And also changing the hiring process from looking for potential employees, say venture away from Craigslist and instead search through Monster, like I had mentioned, and the community college job centers. Internships is another great example that could be used, and other job career sites, Indeed and LinkedIn, etc. To possibly reduce that employee turnover and then get, say, better qualified employees that could then eventually be promoted within to become managers and supervisors and what have you. Also update or reconfigure the employee requirements for the hiring of potential employees, updating the education requirements to have some type of college or higher education over high school and GED, like the East Coast plant. And then also conduct secondary surveys with the production employees to ascertain why respect, leadership, feedback, satisfaction, and even job hunting were ranked neutral or lower in the initial survey. Try to get more of an understanding of what the root causes may be, so that we're not just chasing a managerial issue. Maybe there is something else going on that is unseen that could be corrected. So we definitely think getting a survey out there to employees and focusing more on those characteristics can help us identify what exactly the problem may be. So next slide.
So the implementation plan is pretty much just mirroring the East Coast, changing the production process to mirror exactly the East Coast as it does. Updated train the QN and the QS on how to use the portable spectrometer. Also, we didn't add it in there, but we could say standard work specifically, make it a standard, so that the QA manager can no longer go back and say that they prefer the visual inspection over having the spectrometer, which should be the standard. Update training process for all plant operators, just to make sure that they're all on the same page. And then modernizing the hiring process along with the specifics that entail within it, to make sure that they are getting more robust quality type employees who may have a better potential of more longevity within the plant. And I believe that might be it.
Okay, yeah, another good presentation. Cohort comments, please.
I think I saw something from Matthew on the chat. What was it? I just saw it. Managers should have management training and degree and certificate programs. That was one of the things that had come up, like why is there should have been a higher standard for hiring a supervisor. The only question that came into mind though is for the West Coast plants, like I said, if there have been one of the managers has been there for 3 years, and most of the other employees have also been there for other employees have been there for 3 years. So it may have been that manager started off at the same time as the other employees, and they were maybe promoted, and that's the only thing I can think about at that moment.
Okay, in this presentation, you spent quite a bit of time talking about the managers, and I believe that there's a linkage there. The hard part is to demonstrate it. It's the way that the managers got into their position. You can look at that, which was told to you in the case study. You can say, well, the juniority of the folks at the West Coast plant may have a linkage to the leadership, respect, and accountability here. Maybe they're still learning. And that's a supposition by you. It's too soft of data to say you don't know. That's and you hint back to it over here at the very end. Oops, sorry for whipping through these slides like that. But when you got your recommendations to close the gap, you kind of threw out right here at the very end. It says, hey, maybe we should go back and do some more root cause on the employees to ascertain this business. I don't disagree with you, but I would offer this up though. All right, so I'm sitting here, I'm the leader. Right, in your room, you're going to have some people that are going to be a little bit hurt. Now remember, our company's 25% underperforming at this point. And now I've got my benchmarking team coming back saying they want to go out and do more surveys. So I'd be real careful about offering that at this point, or I'd probably say something to the effect, we should follow up next quarter with another a quick benchmark, and perhaps a new secondary survey to with our line employees. Something along those lines. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, but you're on the right track. You just didn't have enough info to make a solid qualitative linkage between the managers and what the workers were complaining about on the floor. But again, you hit all the salient points. Very nice. Any other comments? All right, this brings us to Team Prime now. I'm hoping it brings us to Team Prime. There we go. All right. I don't know if Jay made it or not, but I know we have plenty of other speakers that can cover the material here. So if someone from Team Prime come up and take over, I'll go on mute.
So this was our Almar Paint Company case study. Our team members are Judith, Jay, Matt, myself, Megan, and DeCarlo, and we are Team Prime. Next slide, please. Outcomes goals for the benchmarking. The Almar Paint Company West Coast plan benchmarking is ultimately the research analysis of quantitative data in order to establish weaknesses and the strengths to make the connections between best practices and performance. Per their charter, the benchmarking team wanted to find performance gaps in productivity and employee satisfaction, and to search for ways to close, even overcome those gaps, and to find a best practice in the process. They also wanted to frame their data collection and analysis regarding staff productivity, process efficiency, cycle time, and the employee satisfaction. Next slide. The methodology used, we determined that it was operational internal primary benchmarking. This was due to the fact that they were trying to change the process to make an aspect of the organization as or more efficient than a different part of the organization that performed the same or similar duties that they did. This internal benchmarking allowed one to find those performance gaps and to provide the improvement within the organization. And tools that were used to gather the raw data were the interviews. They were designed for the production manager, the line manager, and the QA supervisor to understand their perspective of a production run. The second tool was the questionnaires, and they were designed to focus in on small variations in the process, plus the HR data to determine the line employee's experience. And also the third tool was the survey. This was designed to yield qualitative data from production line employees regarding their job satisfaction on how happy or unhappy they were. We also said that there was also some secondary benchmarking going on, and that was with doing the research where they found that a portable spectrometer would help with the inspections to make those maybe go a little bit faster and to provide better results. Next slide. So some of the performance gaps, they was the potential gaps in the staff productivity. You had the fewer operator stations, demotivated staff, and or inefficient training. The potential gaps were in the process efficiency. You had a lot of high rate of defects, inability to forecast the product, the time it takes to fix breakdowns, and the level of automation/technology that was being used. The cycle time with the system breakdowns and the use of outdated equipment, and employee satisfaction. This may be affected by other performance gaps mentioned and caused by training needs, output delivery concerns, poor knowledge of duties and responsibilities. Next slide, please.
So for performance gaps in staff productivity, the team discovered that the gaps we found in regards to staff productivity, which are reflected in the slides for the average, showing the average profile of our production line operators and managers. We found the biggest disparity was in the experience level. As mentioned previously, most of the operators in the West Coast plant only have high school diplomas and are hired through Craigslist, which we found was a bit disturbing. However, that's the process they decided to take on. So we've identified that as being a huge gap between the East Coast workers and the West Coast workers. And the managers had a lot more experience on the East Coast than the West Coast, which really worked to their advantage, because that due to the lack of experience for the West Coast, we saw through the graph the level of respect, the level of productivity had dropped down a lot for the West Coast team. Slide, please. Education for staff productivity, we also found the education and recruiting of the workforce substantially affected the plant. Recruiting through Craigslist and there being only high schoolers for the West Coast plant was part of their downfall, lack of productivity. And as you would see down below in the other slides reflected as one of our implementation plan is to boost the level of productivity by implementing a education plan. And also, we're trying to eliminate the need to hire from Craigslist. Definitely eliminate it and propose that we build a contract with Monster in order to not rely on Craigslist, and then and also adopting a new level of education requirements for the West Coast plan. Slide, please. The East Coast plant order fulfillment plan was to have all pending orders filled and shipped within 7 days. That worked out for them. However, when you look at the West Coast plant, when they had the first in, first out method that took longer and switched over time, that really impeded their progress. And also, when the biggest one being the QA inspector not wanting to stop the production line for pigmentation testing, that was pretty much the death knell to the productivity level and how quickly they can process their orders and being able to be successful at what they needed to do. So those are the main two gaps that we found in regards to efficiency. The container size that they use to the first in, first out method, that was a real impediment. The QA inspector not wanting to stop the production line for pigmentation testing. Next slide, please. Cycle time. Last slide and this slide are interrelated because they reflect the two main gaps that I had already spoke about, which is the first in, first out process that really was decreased their up tempo and was very ineffective, slowing them down, and also stopping the production line in order to do this QA inspection was pretty much the death knell for the plant. Next slide, please. This cumulative survey results for each responder reflects the employee satisfaction survey that we were able to do and gather the data from there. And I attribute that to the maturity level of the workers, because as you look at the West Coast, the level of maturity was not that great, as most of them probably that this is their first job anyways, because they have high schoolers. And then when you're looking at the East Coast, they have more maturity, more time in the job, more the training level was the same. However, their ability to process the execute the mission, execute the job was much better elevated than the West Coast, I believe. I think the maturity level did affect both sides of the house. Next, please. We've already talked about this. Those slides were to be hidden because we talked about those before. Unfortunately, we didn't get to hide those two next slides, 10 and 11. Next, sir.
For the recommendations to close the gaps, in terms of staff productivity, we wanted to establish a new hiring process, diversify the hiring choices, and establish recruiting relationship with a local community college and or trade school. We also wanted to eliminate one hiring source and establish a contract with Monster for more qualified personnel and set up a training program where everyone can be trained at the 9-line positions. And then in terms of process efficiency and cycle time, we wanted to adopt the order fulfillment process implemented at the East Coast plant and adopt the QA process implemented in the East Coast plant as well. And then in terms of the employee job satisfaction, we wanted to review employee communication policies, incorporate more employee incentives to tie into the recommended training program, have the younger West Coast management staff have weekly mentorship meetings with the more experienced East Coast management staff, and look into establishing degree completion programs, develop more opportunities for promotion. Next slide, please. So our implementation plan, by the end of the first week, we would like to have communication to sales staff for assistance, to communicate to customers of the changes to turnaround times, training in the changes to order fulfillment process completed. We'd also like to have the retraining of staff as to new QA process completed and the start of the new process validation. And by the end of the first month, we'd like to have a new hiring process established with diversification of hiring choices. We'd like to set up accounts with Monster, eliminate Craigslist, have local community colleges and trade schools. And then we'd also like to have the shipping department restructured. We'd like to have the training program set up where everyone can be trained at the 9-line positions. The first 3, 6 months, next 3 and end of the first year, final 3 and end of the second year. The 3-week data of the new process, we'd like to have that evaluated. We'd also like employee communication policies reviewed and revised. And we'd also like East and West Coast management staff to have weekly meetings. And by the end of the first quarter, we'd like to have the 3-month data of the new process evaluated. And that's all.
All right, another good presentation here. Cohort comments?
I think it was Judith that was talking about the maturity level, and something that really stuck out. It wasn't so much the presentation, but her wording of it, where she said that it might have been, I believe, the high school education. It might have been their first job. And so at first, it didn't click, but when she actually said it, it actually gave me a little bit different of a picture of a possibility of there being something affecting it. Because she said that it may have been their first job as to why there isn't that maturity in their operations.
Yeah, very interesting. You know, I've gone back to this slide. This morning when I looked at the presentations, this was the first one I looked at because Matthew had sent it to me on email. And I spent a lot of time looking at this. And I've never taken a survey and done a running total like this before. And you're looking, it almost like it's like presenting you a gap, a maturity gap right off the bat. But I need to think about this some more. Team, how did you, what prompted you to come up with this slide? I've not seen it before. Judith or Megan? I think Judith, you were the one talking to this slide. What prompted you to develop this kind of slide? And had you used it before in your career?
Not this one, sir. Actually, this one, I think it's either came from Jahi or Matthew, and I was trying to help out. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, that's
I know
fine.
It was bad.
That's fine. Again, it's just interesting. It even shows a trend analysis, a regression line up here. You can't see the data in it, but I found it to be very interesting. Again, everybody throughout the presentations, you've all identified the key areas that were going wrong in the case studies, and whether you fixated on how to fix the hiring source, or whether there's a correlation between the managers, or whether it's a QA process that needs to be fixed. You all did very well at articulating it, bringing data up onto a screen to tell your story as well. So I didn't have any other findings than that. What I hope that you got out of this case study was the ability to take qualitative data, which was the stuff you got from HR, and I'm sorry, the quantitative data which you got from HR, and the qualitative data you got from the surveys, and use both to present a cogent thought as you're making a presentation and try and make the linkages. I think you all did that. That was really the goal of this whole case study, is for you to see the two types of data, try and mine it and make it make sense. And each team did it so well, very well done. And again, like I said, of the students that I've subjected to this case study, you had all three teams have done better than all the teams before you. So thank you for your work on that. All right, I'm going to bring up the other presentations now, and we'll just shift gears right over to that. All right, so we're back to team variation. I will go on mute and you can start. Wow, what happened there?
Y'all have to tell me when to chime in because I can't see what you're looking at. I don't have internet.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is the first slide. No problem there. Team variation. So a little bit of background. This was in the presentation that was in the class. So I figured this was good so everybody knows what we actually do in real life, right? So we have our names just like on the original slide, but then what we actually do for work, right? So Ron's analytical specialist. I'm a quality manager. Danielle, get a flip back there. So to the next slide.
I'm trying. There's a bit of a mess up here with my visuals. All right, I'm good there. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Danielle's a technical training instructor, and then Sam's a command language program manager. So we can flip to the next slide. So our problem and opportunity statement for MVP is to reduce spring load failures by reducing process variation. So our current process has 40% first pass yield reject rate due to process variation, which comprise of rework and scrap. The process is currently costing $24,000 a month in scrap, and will increase to $48,000 when we're in full production. And actually, we're getting close to that now, the $48,000 a month. I think last month we were looking at about 35K. So the main critical part of this is to keep the customer, enough parts fed to the customer line. So as long as we keep on-time delivery up, the scrap dollars can be consumed. Even though it's painful, first pass yield on the spring load needs to be optimized so that we can keep the product line running. Next slide.
So each one of us for our secondary benchmarking decided to go off in separate areas of study. I personally try to go outside the industry and went to kind of a similar high quality, high demand kind of field of medical devices, pharmaceutical era. We went back into the industry and look at the welding. That seemed to be one of indicators of being one of the big problems, and we wanted to research welding. Then we went into kind of a macroscopic overview of core spring manufacturing itself. It's kind of what we do, and it's kind of worth looking into. And we rounded that off with looking at the materials themselves, the actual stamping of the metals, and do that. Next slide, please. So I'll start with my secondary benchmark of medical devices. Found a lot of articles out there dealing with the high volume, high quality, high demanding, and almost detrimental to life industry of the medical industry, which kind of it's right along the lines of our spring loads, because we put our springs in jet engines and what have you, and that's detrimental to life as well. One of the things that I focused on was Myriad is a quality-led medical device company. It actually won the 2003 Baldrige Award. The company created a work environment empowering employees themselves to create best practices for the company and take ownership with high quality, high demanding field and the right first time industry. So they did not hire anybody outside consultants even to implement the skeleton. They kind of just looked within and grew. And some of the things that they went forward are they use value stream mapping, visual work instruction, and Kanban, and move from a straight line manufacturing to a cellular manufacturing concept, which is something that we may look into. It's kind of like the layout of the machines and people, often different types performing different operations all within one kind of like area. It seemed to work for them. And lastly, their visual instruction. They previously used engineering blueprints and standard operation instructions, which made it difficult for employees to follow the process made training complicated, and the team developed color-coded visual work instructions that represented each step in an assembly type of process, which completely eliminated the need for these old blueprint standard operating instructions that wasn't working for them. So essentially, that standardized production across all lines, a visual representation of each step in the process, had very little in the way of written instruction, which facilitated a smooth, consistent workflow, increasing cross-training, and this actually showed to have a 35% reduction in the product defects. So it's definitely something that we might leverage into maybe adopting into our project here. Dave?
So the next ones were spring rate optimization and spring rate selection tool. So it's pretty amazing to figure out. I mean, if you look at all the stuff that uses some kind of spring in it, for all kinds of applications, right? So there's a ton of stuff to benchmark off of, but there's a lot of information out there about spring rate optimization, because the one I happened to find was really people trying to refine spring rates so they can get the most efficiency out of the spring that they're using. So really good benchmarking to figure out, are we using the best spring rate that we possibly can in the application to get the most bang for our buck design wise. And the second one was a spring rate selection tool. So there's been a lot of data analysis and benchmarking already done in the field of trying to figure out the spring rates and how to select the different springs for applications. So as you know, there's a lot of springs out there as far as coil springs and leaf springs and concave washer springs and all kinds of different springs. So they've actually gone through and for applications and what you're trying to accomplish, and they have a selection tool that this one company put together, a full benchmarked scenario where they actually brought in data from all kinds of different spring manufacturers and put together the best selection tool for spring rates. So very useful and very interesting. Danielle, yours is the next one.
Okay, thanks. The two top picks of mine of what I focused on this area was stamping metal plates and then also heat treatment of metal, as this is a very similar process of how the company that we're currently with is also doing the process. So one of the articles, the effective strain rates on aluminum foils. There was a lot of good information on this. Some learning points that I brought to mind was punching rate speeds. What the article was talking about is as the increased speeds of getting the mill process stamped actually yielded better results as to the structural formability of the metal. The thickness of the plates were slightly beneficial to adding the increased strength, but the speed ultimately of how fast the metal was punched showed significant results as to the pass rate. So I saw this as a relevance to the current project as possibly changing the current process of maybe having a higher spring load pass rate if the metal stamping process speed was examined for future opportunities of reducing our scrap metal work and rework costs. The other article, which was the heat treatment, some results from that one that I pulled from that, temperature values within a certain degree range, which was 1950 to 2120 degrees, yielded in that range an improved impact toughness level. The article also stated that higher levels of impact and tensile properties were possible when the metal samples went under multiple heat treatments at different temperatures. So this information I also consider relevant, as the high temperature treatment has proved to significantly reduce the average number of fracture areas in pour metals, as this article illustrates. And this information could be useful in researching the strength of various metals used part of the production process. And who's next?
Sam, you're up. No, we can't hear you, Sam.
Okay, let's move on. If we can't get Sam online, we'll just go on to the next slide.
Okay, next slide. Yep. So we have some primary benchmarking partners. So we looked at internally, Eaton, they have an engineering lab in Southfield, Michigan, and going there and reviewing the engineering documents for spring design for multiple applications. So the Southfield Engineering Lab, they actually do a lot of engineering applications for vehicle, which is truck and automotive. They also do a lot of work in hydraulics and electrical. So a lot of electrical stuff, breakers and switching gear and stuff like that has a lot of springs in it. So they have a lot of information that we can actually use to benchmark off of and get technical information and different designs, why things were designed how they were, and to get the different kinds of technical data from them. And then we were looking at a competitive benchmark with Pratt & Whitney. They're an engine manufacturer for aircraft. And reviewing their processes, work instructions, SOPs, KPIs, as it relates to process variation and reduction of that variation in the processes. So we can actually see where they've gone and benchmarked a lot of their streamlining or leaning out of their processes to have the most efficient system possible. And then a functional benchmark with a competitor, but not really a direct competitor, which is MagSeal, and they're in Rhode Island, but they make magnetic seals, which is a different kind of seal as far as the sealing application goes, but they have a tremendous amount of information, knowledge on the industry, and as far as building seals and how the process flow for how they build seals on their site and the strategy that goes along with that. And as far as them building the market information and what people are looking for in the market today. Next slide. I think this was Sam's too. Sam, we still can't hear you, just so you know. I see your chat's popping up there.
And can someone else take it?
Yep, so secondary benchmarking is complete. We have identified potential primary benchmarking partners we need to reach out to, develop survey questionnaires, develop primary data collection plans, conduct primary benchmarking. So assimilate information, conduct analysis of primary data, compare performance, current versus projected, identify and target new performance levels, and then analyze partner organizations, processes, procedures, and then develop recommendations off those. Next slide. So next steps, so act on the information. So reach an agreement amongst the managers and the MVP champion on a way forward, develop an implementation plan, initiate that plan, and then monitor the implementation and adjust as needed for that plan. Next slide. Danielle, did you have issues, challenges in key learning?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay.
Okay, so looking here at our issues, challenges, key learnings, quality improvement teams, I feel are most effective and efficient if there's a facilitator, and that role is typically filled by either your team leader or another individual. So the more critical or highly visible the project, the more important it is that the team is guided by somebody specifically trained and experienced in facilitation and team development. So being prepared for challenges such as staff resistance to changes, to come into some conflict. Once someone is experienced and comfortable with their job, they're typically not prepared for things to change. So being prepared for those challenges is going to cause some conflict, so we should be prepared for that. Typically conflict when change is involved is always brought into the matrix. These include will the employees feeling threatened if their job is in jeopardy, or what these changes mean to them and their future within the company, or what they might be asking themselves, such as what procedures do I need to learn, and can I remember them? What if I create an error in the new process? And it's important to illustrate to the employees that there's going to be a learning curve during the new process, and errors are going to be expected, so don't freak out. We can also expect production delays during implementation as the new process is being put to the test, which can cause frustration, and this is not the norm of the everyday operations, so causing possibly overtime hours employees may not be prepared for or may not be willing to accommodate as we implement this. This leads us to planning. When a solution is chosen, planning carefully to carry it out is essential. A good plan indicates the who, what, and when factors. So things we should be asking is, what should be considered here? What could go wrong? Or what will stand in the way? And this includes identifying predictable obstacles or barriers and how to avoid or overcome them. And if we run into a roadblock, we should put a plan into writing as to how are we going to react if there is a worst case scenario and be prepared. Lastly, we can predict a certain cost associated with these changes made. This can include new software, firmware, equipment, installation costs from certified technicians, and additionally, there might be reoccurring inspection or maintenance costs due to the new equipment. And part of this implementation, we should also consider the addition of employees that might be required as an associated cost, and additionally, hourly overtime costs, which may be required to train these new procedures to personnel in the current operations. Some key learnings I think we can take away here is that there is valuable information in the benchmarking process. With the information just that we've gathered as a team is definitely, we've got some good solid information to branch off from the findings here. And this concludes our presentation.
Okay, team. Yeah, very nice. Sam, sorry you couldn't get in there and play. That's how it goes. Cohort comments?
I like what they found for their secondary research, because in my mind, as they were mentioning some of the, Pratt and Whitney is, if I remember still right, is part of Utah's. But it just made me think in terms of springs of other manufacturers, and I think Ron mentioned automotive ones, if I remember correctly. So it's really interesting to see that they're looking at not only how the springs are made and the punch out processes and even varying temperatures, how that could affect their items.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it was remarkable. This is a good sized team here. With 4 members on it, and just think they had 24 secondary researches they had to do, and they came in and they just went off on the most important ones. So the whole goal with secondary benchmarking is you're just trying to be an inch wide on a subject, but go a mile deep, and That's how you do it. So it's hard work to get there and to be thinking like that, but you know, with what they offered up, it sure gave them a pathway of thinking on how to go about their benchmark. Thanks, Edgar. And thanks, team. That was really good. Let me ask you, though, before we shift over to another team here, are you going to use any of these slides in your MVP?
I don't know if we've gotten that far yet. There's definitely some stuff we could extract out of there and put in the MVP for sure. We just don't have that finalized.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, again, thank you. It was a good presentation. I'm going to drop yours off the screen, and we will bring up the next one. Edgar and Cam, you're up next. All right, I'll go on mute, and you have it.
All right, hello again, Team UTC, and this is our MVP benchmarking plan. Next slide. So just to kind of give you an idea of what Edgar and I do, yes, we're both students here at NGS, but we're also both quality inspectors at UTC. And our senior champion, Mark, is the quality manager of our site. And then the day-to-day champions, Guillermo Gonzalez is our quality supervisor. Mike Makarak is the production supervisor, and Angela Damian is a quality manager who reports to Mark. Next slide.
Bear with me for just a second. Okay, so our problem statement is FPY related. Several quality, we actually updated this after meeting with our champion the last time. So now it's turned into quality process inconsistencies and paperwork errors have led to, not customer escapes, to final rejections within our cell from the internal process of the Boeing 737 production cell. There has been some money caused due to rework, scrap, and time allotted into it. The FPY for the current goal for the FPY within that cell is 98.8%. Was established at the beginning of the year, and there was a noticeable trend within the first quarter, which is lower than this. And one of the things that we did discuss with our champions that we needed to add the current FPY numbers that we have, along with some changes that, or some information that he wanted to dish out. Next slide.
Okay, so some of our key indicators. So internally, we'd like to benchmark. We want to compare our process to processes within our organization. That's both, you know, either a different cell, different department, what have you, as well as our local sites, which we have another site located just down the road that we would like to, which would be a great benchmarking site to visit and see how they do their process and what they do to keep their FPY percentage at their goal and above. And the non-local sites, I should have put down an external, but external benchmarking would be look at organizations outside of ours, which it's hard with the evacs system because there's not a whole lot of companies that do evacuation slides. So I kind of considered a non-local site kind of as a external benchmarking partner. And then a competitive partner would someone look at a competitive organization and analyze them and what they do to keep their FPY percentage high, what processes, what tools, what kind of standard work they use, so forth. And functional and generic, those bottom lines kind of got mixed up. So With functional, we of course find an organization with a similar process and analyze them and what they do. And then that bottom line there, local manufacturing companies, should be under generic. And then the compare across the aerospace market should be more under functional. Kind of got that one mixed up. But of course with generic, we want to look at other manufacturing companies, what they do to reduce rejections, reduce paperwork errors, data entry mistakes, so forth. And then with functional, of course, across the aerospace market, see what other aerospace companies do to keep their FPY percentage high and reduce paperwork issues, data entry mistakes, so forth. Next slide.
So some of the things that came up from our secondary research, a lot of ours have to do more with human error, but there were some applications in terms of supplies that we use or the tooling or the programs and systems that we have. So a lot of the things that we're looking at, we're talking about switching from physical paper or changing the layout of the paper. So one of the things that we're looking at is the form layout. We've had several issues with missing initials, missing information, stamps, and we attribute this more to the layout of the paperwork. We were checking on some of the secondary benchmark research things that we did. They were talking about how when they structure paperwork, not only does it have to be clear, but the spacing of your wording to the perimeter bars or the outlines, if you will, the perimeter borders. And so one of the things that we saw with ours is that sometimes our paperwork tends to be too, not clunky, but too many of the parts are too close together. And so a lot of times that mixes up people and it causes them to either miss a point where they needed to fill out information. So the form layouts is one of the things that we're looking at. We definitely want to encourage technology innovation. Several of the things that we're reading all said something to do with tablet, RFID, mobile workstations. And so we definitely want to push that. It may be a hard thing to sell at this moment, but even our champion was behind it. He also indicated that we are working more with an antiquated system. And so he would like to see more improvement on that. So we might not be able to fully dish out the digital portion of it, but we can definitely want to encourage leadership to actually really take in the idea and possibly even let us test as a pilot just one, either our cell or another cell that is doing, whose FPY is also being an issue due to paperwork issues. Reoccurring training is one of the other ones. This is more for the human factor, where we've had a lot of issues where people miss the same issue or same sign-offs, or they just don't know what the paperwork consists of. So having a reoccurring training to remind everybody of what's included in paperwork, what to look for specifically, would help also improve not having so many rejections. Our champion mentioned that he did one more with centralized documentation, and what we mean by this is that a lot of the times we spend a lot of time just searching for a certain document or a certain procedure, certain paperwork in our data system. And so one of the things that they wanted was, well, one of the things that I read was about how his hospital was working with a lot of physical paperwork, and they went into using more of a the same system, and everybody having access to it, making the access to like patient records be a lot faster instead of having to hunt them down in a filing cabinet or have it said something about having the patient fill out paperwork and even having incomplete paperwork. So sometimes they might have missed out some information from some forms that should have been there, and having that documentation there readily accessible with everybody knowing where the source is for it definitely helps cut time and increase productivity. And then we also want to help encourage have people have more personal ownership of their work, and definitely the accountability. a lot of the times our QA department is kind of seen as like, well, they're the ones that have to check stuff, so nothing should get across to them. Kind of like relying on us to catch all the mistakes, but that really shouldn't be the case. It should be more that people do the steps that they're supposed to do. Everybody's supposed to sign off on their own steps, and there really shouldn't be any issues other than QA verifying critical inspection points that were deemed critical not only by the customer but also internally. Next slide.
Look, I normally don't jump in on anybody's lecture, but I agree with you. QA is not there to be the inspector of the work. You know, you're there just to make sure that the whole process is working along as it's supposed to. And as you mentioned in your at another point, if you ever get into a cell design, you know, all the line members are inspecting because you're only moving a piece through one at a time instead of working on big batches. Anyway, I'm back on mute. Next slide.
All right, so looking at potential primary benchmarking targets, internally, like I mentioned before, the Phoenix Hamilton site, which is the site that's just down the road from our site. And the method would be reviewing their process and how they are able to maintain their FPY percentage. Is it do they use one-piece flow? Do they use a stock market? What special tools or equipment do they use? Do they still use a form of documentation or paperwork, or do they do more of a electronic or digital type device of entering data, what have you? And so we look at that as a primary benchmarking target, both operational and strategic. Looking at a competitive benchmark, it would be Rockwell Collins, and it's similar to the Phoenix Hamilton site, where we would like to review their process and how they manage to maintain their FPY percentage. What kind of equipment do they use? What's their layout? What do they look for? What type of rejections do they have? Are they similar to our rejections? Or is it a lot of paperwork issues, data entry issues, or is it supplier issues? Functional would be, we looked at Amazon and reviewing their handheld scanner system and the ease of use of that scanner system, and also their error rates. One of the secondary benchmark articles that I read was about how with Amazon using their handheld scanner system, how they were able to track employees from basically every second of the day, and track products every second of the day, from when they get scanned in, when they get scanned out, where they basically it's an easier way to track the product throughout the entire process, as well as the employees of when they finished a certain step or when they started a certain step. So that's definitely something we would like to look into, both as operationally, both a primary and secondary, and then strategically a secondary. A generic benchmark partner would be we found at BJ's Brewery, because over there they use a tablet system to take orders. So that's something we would like to look into, especially how efficient is it? What type of data entry issues do they experience? And then does it improve their efficiency? Is it easier than, say, using a pen and paper, and so forth? So, and we look at that as both a primary for operational and secondary for strategic. Next slide. So
sorry, go ahead, Kim. Sorry.
So next steps and key milestones. So hypothetically, we would meet with the champion to discuss our benchmarking plan and how we would like to go about it, and what our champion would like to gain from our benchmark. And so for November 3rd, we would actually meet with the Hamilton site and talk with their leadership and kind of gauge, what we're looking for and how we would like to go about benchmarking them and what kind of obstacles might come up and what they can do to help us get the most out of what we're looking for during our benchmark. And then the following week, the 6th through the 8th, we would, of course, actually do the benchmark. We would review their process, see, from start to finish, how they, how the product follows throughout their process line, what tools they use, what systems they use, what type of rejections may occur, and how they handle those rejections throughout the process. And then the following week, the whole week, our team would conduct further secondary research to narrow the results. So based off what we gathered from Hamilton during our data collection, we would like to expand on that with more secondary research and kind of see if some of that stuff is applicable to what we do over at our site. And then on the 22nd, we would have a meeting where we would compile all of our data and research and basically see what all we got and kind of start to create a foundation for a implementation or a final end result. And then for the following 3 weeks, every Monday, we would plan to meet and analyze and refine our benchmarking, and this would also include our senior champion, to where our champion can take in the data that we collected and also kind of help direct us in the direction that he would like to go, and what data or ideas might not be applicable for what we do, and how he can help us meet that end goal. Next slide.
So some of the issues and challenges that we're looking to face and that we've actually been facing since the beginning of our project. For one is our traveling schedule. Our department manager has had a larger workload, so he's not able to be on site as much. So last time we did have a meeting, we did communicate more, and we did establish that even if we couldn't meet face to face, there were other opportunities for using something like video conferencing to make sure that we're still on the same page. The current workload, aside from our workload in general, because there are various projects running at this time through our facility, and either Cameron or myself are being seen as leaders in some of those projects. Getting benchmark approval, of course, is one of the big ones. Probably the biggest one of them all is really getting buy-in for technology ideas. Like I mentioned before, we would love to go into digital, but that just is more dependent on budget and leadership needs and wants. Documentation finalizing opportunities is just getting together with people and seeing what have they seen wrong with the paperwork. The main reason for this is a lot of the times anybody can put in a submitted request to change the paperwork, but not everybody really agrees with it. So it would be nice to have an agreement and a buy-in from everybody on what specifically they need to see on the paperwork and what is definitely critical and cannot be moved out. Creating a training plan development and buying into the training plan, not only mostly for the QAs, and kind of also link it to the operations in some instances, more so like more specifically with paperwork, like getting them all trained to know this is what a full packet looks like for a unit. So all these pages should be in there, and this is the specific information that should be in there and should not be missed. More so pertaining to the actual rejections that we've had, because a lot of them have been very similar, and so we definitely want to point those specific ones out. And then just getting the buy-in overall from operations, supervisors, and the champions to make sure that the changes that we do want to make actually do last, and that everybody at least has a positive agreement toward them, because it is not only going to help us, but it should help. It's one of the things that we can not only establish in this cell, but also pass it on to other cells and maybe even other departments. Next slide. And that's it.
All right, good job, guys. It's always good to see you UTAS guys, especially knowing Mark and Guillermo as past students of mine. So I think I had them in my finance course, but very good. Let me ask you, let's see, this slide, 2 thumbs up. This slide, probably should have just cut it, but that's just me. I like this one. When you got it here, you're just cooking with fuel. So that one didn't do much to me. The key indicators, I probably would have had something else there. But anyway, I really liked your presentation. Let me ask you, are you guys going to include any of this in your MVP?
I think there would be a couple slides that we may want to include, or we just haven't specified or thought of which one specifically. But
yeah, yeah, this one might fit in there for you. I don't know. That's always the weirdness with this course.
Yeah.
Cohort, any comments? All right. Well, I thought you guys did just fine. Kim, Edgar, it was a pleasure having you. I'm going to move on to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Prime, you're up next. Okay, I'm going to go on mute. You guys take over.
So this is Team Prime. Our team includes Judith, Jay, Matt, Megan, and DeCarlo. Next slide, please. Our team members are Matt. He is a quality control manager. DeCarlo, she is a quality auditor. Megan is a technical analyst. Jay is a production superintendent, senior non-commissioned officer for the U.S. Air Force. And Judith is an analysis branch chief for the U.S. Army. Next slide, please. So our sponsor that we are working with is the 723 Aircraft Maintenance Squadron. Their mission statement is, we maintain so others may live. And what they do is they provide air support for refueling other aircraft in the air, rescue operations, military and domestic, combat support, transport and drop-off equipment, and people to selected destinations. They have a total of 9 aircraft, and those aircraft are the C-130J Combat King II. And they have about 350 plus personnel that work there as well. Next slide, please. So our problem is that parts unavailability when ordered, and the time that it takes to get them to their destination from the point of origin. We actually met with Lieutenant Colonel Dunson, and he actually made some changes for us. We did have that we wanted all of the aircraft to be at 100% fully mission capable, but in all reality, that's not always going to be possible. So he wanted us to drop that down to having all aircraft of the fleet to be at 86% or higher for fully mission capable. And if it consistently failed below the 86%, which could be due to parts unavailability or parts order around time, then this will become our target for process improvement. Granted, we know that an important factor on the parts, this comes from several different vendors, and this is in the contract agreement with the remaining armed services, which can include the Army, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard. And this similarly has caused delay in the parts reaching the maintenance warehouses. and unit readiness is greatly degraded by this situation. Next slide, please. So our problem statement is that our C-13LJ Combat King II aircraft, they have a significant downtime that is greater than the 24 hours, and this is due to the parts and material unavailability during that unscheduled maintenance or the repair of the aircraft. After speaking to Lieutenant Colonel Dunson, we wanted to be able to shorten the unscheduled aircraft maintenance / repair turnaround time by reducing 24 hours from that average delay. And in the request for the parts during the procurement process. And we're hoping that this can enable at least one minimal flight time with the refueling per day, contribute to that increased FMC rating, the fully mission capable, which we ideally would like to be above 86% with the aircraft placed back into service, and to promote that unit readiness and ability to carry out their missions. Next slide, please. So our first focus areas for benchmarking, we have the KPI, which is the unit MC rate. This is measured every 24 hours. We have our internal benchmarking, which our topics are streamlining the maintenance parts procurement process, the parts that are being ordered, how long does it take once they place in that order for the parts to be shipped to them, the tracking, the supply, and the forecasting. And we have functional benchmarking, and the topics there are for streamlining the maintenance parts procurement process. And then we have our generic benchmarking, and we're looking at the parts ordering again, the tracking, supply, and forecasting, kind of digging into the vendor contracts and the best practices that are being used. Next slide. These are our findings that were picked out amongst our team for secondary research. And I won't go through all of these because we're actually going to split these up. And we'll each talk about the two that we have. So we can go to the next slide.
Sir, for the my findings, the first one, new repair process offers success, is an article that I found very worthwhile, and that leads into the problem set that we're looking into in regards to our parts procurement and repairs. This article highlighted what the process that the 20th Air Wing Maintenance Group at Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, what the process they use in order to keep their aircraft airborne and not on the ground. The application for to our MVP is it will help us review our current repair depot processes. We do have a couple of depots on post, but the processes of getting the parts out of those depots have been really delayed due to the fact that how they get the parts into the depot and then us being notified, the maintenance crew that is in the hangar, how they notified when the parts get there, and the time that it takes for us to come from the hangar to those depots to get the parts ordered. So that will help us looking at the process that the 20th Maintenance Group at Shaw Air Force Base used. That will help us streamline the process, our process, a little bit better. And secondly, I saw how we could apply it to the MVP is to renegotiate the maintenance plan with the depots because of the priority level that they have, who gets priority number one, and how that would impact us getting our parts that we need, and establishing a list of priorities for those parts. Thirdly, we look into establishing a timeline for repairs and returns, and being prepared to provide supporting documents and facts. in renegotiating the maintenance plan, we want to be able to have our facts, everything in order to show them how the process has not been working in our favor, thus affecting our aircraft not being able to be airborne. Key learning points in this with this article is the program that they use is being used. This program is being used for another crew, the Fighting Falcons, out of Shaw Air Force Base. So my suggestion would be to do some type of a SME, which is a subject matter expert exchange, that in order for them to exchange CTPs, exchange ideas, whether they come here, they come to us as an MTT, mobile training team, or we go to them, whatever means we can use to exchange ideas and CTPs with that other air crew. And will it be cost effective? It's been used with another unit, but will it be as effective with us in regards to the cost utilized to provide that support? Potential application for future MBB teams. We said that they can establish a tracking system for the parts, build relationships with other maintenance crews and repair depots, build a maintenance plan with the repair depots, and apply this as a test-based project to ensure effectiveness. Don't go at it full throttle, but do a couple of beta tests and to see how it will apply, slowly but surely integrating it into the unit. The second one, estimation of basic mission benefits. I will go quickly over this. It's the health and usage monitoring system, the HUMS. It's been applied in its U.S. Army unit with some success, but it costs them. And although it's been successful in that other unit, which is an Army unit with their aircrafts, how could we apply this to a U.S. Air Force aircraft unit? It has not been tested, and it's undetermined whether or not it'll be effective, but it's worth a look-see. It's worthwhile to take a look at it, how the Army has been able to apply it, and to see what are the pros and cons in us applying this to our problem set. Next slide, please. Those two articles were found by Jamil. I will quickly go over his notes. The first article is from
let's move on for Jay because he's not here. I've read his stuff online, so we'll go on to the next slide.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Want to move on over? Same thing for Matthew. He has notes, which you've seen, sir. Okay, Megan.
So, diagnosing the Army's equipment readiness. This was describing the EDA, which is known as the Equipment Downtime Analyzer, and this was a set of metrics. This can help link the process performance to equipment readiness, which can help us with our project and to help giving a tool for integrating and gathering information needed. Projected application was that the improvement for this equipment readiness, the measurement gaps that they were using, the repair and failure records, and the why behind their broke to fix time. The learning points were that the customer wait time, parts that drive readiness, and the failure rate problem. Potential application is that the EDA helps the Army insight into the equipment readiness comparable to the insight that activity-based cost system, and it was providing them with regards to their cost, and that their NTM is the average in item repair time compared to the end item failure rate. The other article, the aircraft schedule recovery problem, this was talking about a ASRP, and that was defined as modifying the flight and aircraft schedule to compensate the presence of irregular operations that were resulting in temporary or permanent unavailability of the aircraft. And they decided to try a disruption set solver, which is also known as the DSS, and it was tackling the aircraft schedule disruptions in a dynamic way. It was applying a set of real disrupted days in the operation of a major African airline. And the learning points was that it proposed that the CSS framework could be used to solve the real aircraft schedule disruption problems within a time window that could be suitable for real-time operations. Potential application is that CSS, it was ran every single time that they had a new aircraft disruption, and that information was made available. The data results were very analyzed by dynamic versus the static to analyze their cost. And it showed that in all the test cases, a solution could be found within a short time window, which we could also maybe correlate back to our problem. Next slide.
For the first topic, benchmarking contract management process maturity, a case of the US Navy, the rationale was that a maturity model is used to benchmark an organization's contract management process maturity, and the results are used to develop a roadmap for the implementation of improvement and knowledge sharing initiatives. So reports on the U.S. Department of Defense contract management process deficiencies identified poor contract planning and contract administration. So how we'd apply this to our MVP is through contract process improvement initiatives, procurement improvement, ensure that money is spent in the most efficient and effective ways, identify gaps in performance, contract process, and procurement process. The learning points from this article were that higher maturity levels are shown in the pre-award contracting focus points, areas such as procurement planning, solicitation planning, and source selection, and lower maturity levels when it comes to the administration of contracts and the closeout, which shows the best practices are applied in the planning phase and poor dedication to the processes shown after contracts are awarded to vendors. Potential application for future MVP teams, filling performance gaps, process improvement initiatives, examining vendor relationships before and during the contract, and finding ways to improve. The rationale for the second topic, knowledge-based decision support, system in the design and control of warehouse operations. The rationale is that the emphasis on warehousing has shifted from inventory stock control to fast response operations. Order pickup has been rated as the most labor and capital intensive operation that is ranked a high priority in productivity improvement. So this research paves the way for an approach that will support the decision-making processes of policy selection and resource allocation in warehouses. So it was a case study of Genco and ETL freight companies. So how we would apply this to our MVP is through streamlining the pod storage process and applying KDSS to an improved process and forecast results, and also review and interview warehouse personnel. And the potential application for future MVP teams would be to measure reliability and productivity and improve the process involving KDSS and identifying gaps and developing measures to close them. Next slide, please. So this is our primary benchmarking topics and potential partners. In terms of streamlining the maintenance parts procurement process and parts ordering, tracking, supply, and forecasting, our partners would be the 20th MXG Airmen, Shaw AFB SC, or Warner Robins Air Logistics Complex. And for streamlining the maintenance parts procurement process would be the US Army AH-64. For parts ordering, tracking, supplying, and forecasting, the UK Royal Air Force, for vendor contracts, the US Navy study, and for best practices, GENCO or ETL freight companies. These are for warehouse operations. Next slide, please. So the next steps and key milestones for primary and secondary benchmarking activities from now through final course class is from the 30th of October, we had the key measures of success. And then from the 20th of November, we'll have the benchmarking results. From the 4th of December, we'll have the implementation plan, the pilot. And thereon, on the 18th or sooner, with start data on aircraft declared non-mission capable. And then from January 2018, we'll have pilot test results, the final data collecting ends. And in February, we'll have the final data set delivered and the full implementation plan. And then from March, we'll have the results monitoring, the presentation, and we'll complete the milestones. Next slide, please.
So for the issues and challenges that we have faced throughout this, I'm looking into the problem set. Those are the ones that we think are key ones to highlight today. Data analysis and interpretation. From the beginning, we've gathered a lot of data from the maintenance crew for the 723rd, and being able to analyze that data, making it palatable, I would say, and then being able to interpret it and pull out what are the key what are the things of value to us in order to make our assessment. That was something that really took us some time to go through and digest, and being able to come up with something that we can use. Getting the buy-in from the champion, as stated by Megan in the beginning, our meeting with the champion, Lieutenant Colonel Dunstan, was our eureka moment, if I may use the word. He pretty much put us back on the right path on exactly what he was looking for. And looking at time versus money, we had a little piece about money, cost effectiveness, or something like on our problem statement, which he pretty much didn't like seeing, because we're in a military unit and we don't really go after making money, or I should say we're non-profit, so we don't really look at the money aspect of it. We're looking at how we can save time, how we can be more proficient at what we do. So he pretty much highlighted that fact that we might need to take that piece out, which you didn't see in our problem statement today. Time management, pretty much us being able to accomplish all of our individual tasks on time, being able to curate QC our data, and getting feedback from each other more often, and being able to be ready for those briefings. Getting on the same page and understanding pretty much the same thing. We have a very good team. Just a matter of life happens, and we do have challenges that we all need to be apprised of. We've been very understanding. We know life happens, issues come up, and not everyone is able to meet at the same time, but we've been able, through emails and different venues, gather around and put our thoughts together. Next slide, please. Key learnings, sir. Understanding and meeting the champion's requirements. This is definitely a priority for us. And having met with him, he was able to pretty much give us, putting us in the right path to success by giving us an achievable goal, because 100% was definitely not realistic and achievable. So putting us at that scale of 86% FMC for the unit, I think it's more achievable, a little bit more realistic, something that we can work with. So we definitely appreciated that from that meeting. getting the champion's perspective, definitely sitting down with him, or even if it was over the phones, hearing from him how he perceived the situation, how he looks at it, how he knows his unit. So getting his perspective was key. Reaching a milestone and understanding the root cause of the problem, that definitely was one of the key learning points from that last meeting with the champion. Generating possible solutions after meeting the champion. Yes, we were able to do that. We were able to brainstorm a little bit. We have notes from the meeting. We're able to dive into it and come up with possible solutions to the problem set, which we're looking into implementing with the timeline and that Carlo just went over. Any questions, sir? I think that was our last slide.
It was. That was very good. Whoops, what happened there? I definitely agree with what you're saying about the senior champion. They give you the breakthroughs. They set the what's called the tact. The tact time, like you could in manufacturing, how fast things have to be turned around. As importantly, what they're focused on. I don't disagree with your comments about concerns are more about time than they are money. Unless you're showing a senior champion how to save money, then they're usually intrigued by that. Especially, I'm talking about military senior champions. So, Ash, same question. Are you going to take any of these slides to your MVP?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, well, that's good. What I recommend for every team is you all have done very good presentations this evening. I would take your secondary research, and I would probably take, everybody had a slide similar to this one here. And what I would do with that is I would drop it at the end of your MVP as hidden slides for now. And as the next few courses go along, you'll see if there's relativity between them and as you progress. This is one of these, this is like the baking class in a course curriculum. This is our home ed. We're giving you the recipe on how to do benchmarking. It's a cornerstone of quality, but our system here at NGS isn't set up on this benchmarking. We're set up on to make. So we present this kind of the midway, because right now you have the lean tools, not too many Six Sigma tools, but you certainly have a lean tool chest right now. And this is where we want to start showing you qualitative and quantitative data, questionnaires, and things to ask. But the reality is that as you move on from this class, as you go into financial systems and further on to business analytics, they're going to give you a lot of slides for your MVP. And what you get out of this one here is mostly the secondary research. If it helps to form your thinking on what your future state is. Everybody right now has a current state, what your problem statement is. And you all have an idea of where you want to be. But in the next couple of classes, you're going to be going into a future state, especially when you start looking at internal and external failures. You're going to look at, hey, what happened? What went wrong? Why did it cost us this money? And then what do we have to do to correct the problem? Then when you start looking at how you correct the problem, that's when you start defining the future state. So that's what's going ahead for you. Cohort, any other comments for the presentations? Anything back for this most excellent presentation by Team Prime? Okay, well then with that said, I appreciate it. I know we went a little bit long, but that's what it takes to get these presentations done. I will communicate with everybody back through the portal tomorrow with comments on that I've taken during the presentations, and I'll be in contact with students if you still owe work. And here's what you need to do: is that we're still in week 5. If you go look at the week 5 discussion question, I'm simply asking, what did you get out of this course? So I'm not looking for, the platitudes. I'm just looking for what you got out of it. And then if you would, do your end of course evaluations as well. I'm particularly interested in what you think about week 4, where we gave you the extra time to get the Almar project done alongside your MVP. So I see this as a backloaded course. In other words, the first three weeks were looking kind of easy on deliverables, and then the last 2 are pretty hard. So I look forward to any feedback you have from that. And with that said, we're at the end of our webinar for tonight. Thank you for being here. I'll stay online if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you on the portal and through email. And I wish you luck as you go on. You're almost done. Just a few more months, and you guys will be quality systems masters. And it's a good thing. It's really paid me well in my career.
Thank you for the course. We greatly appreciate it. It was a pleasure. And
Thanks, Edgar.